Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm David French with Curtis Chang, and I'm really very happy about this podcast already. We've barely started, but I'm already happy about this podcast. We have a guest. Jonathan Tjarks from The Ringer, one of my favorite podcasts, The Ringer NBA show. Now, Curtis is going to more fully introduce Jonathan, but I just want to go ahead and say we're not going to talk about. So if you've come here to talk about, faith and to hear a discussion of faith and culture, that's what we're going to talk about. But we are going to save about 10 minutes. So at the very end, we're going to save about 10 minutes for some NBA commentary. So I'm just telling you now, and for most of you, if you've listened to me for any length of time, you're also here for NBA commentary. But we're going to save the final part for some NBA commentary. But I'm really excited about our guest today. And Curtis, why don't you introduce Jonathan and let's just get started.
Yeah, well, I think the listeners of the Good Faith might assume that the first thing in the morning that like maybe David does when he reads is the latest Supreme Court rulings or the latest geopolitical analysis. And maybe for me, they might assume the first thing I read is the latest theological treatise or something. At least for me, that's not true. The first thing I read when I'm gathering my breakfast cereal together, I turn to The Ringer, and I've done so ever since The Ringer was launched. I love The Ringer because it covers what is kind of trivial topics in terms of sports and popular culture most of the time, but it does so with such smart writing. And one of the smartest writers covering the NBA beat for The Ringer is Jonathan Tjarks. And I was last week turning to The Ringer at 8 o'clock in the morning over my breakfast cereal, and I saw a piece from him titled, "Do You Know My Son?" And then when I read it, I was like, this is completely different than the type of piece I've come to expect from The Ringer, but it was so good and it grabbed me really at a very visceral level. And it also connects to so many of the topics that we've talked about at Good Faith that I thought we just got to absolutely have Jonathan. So Jonathan, welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. It's an honor to have you. Thank you for joining us. And could you start by just kind of, I'm not sure how many of our audience actually are Ringer readers themselves, but could you start by just telling the story of your piece, Do You Know My Son? And then we'll kind of go from there.
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks for having me on. I appreciate the kind words and the support. I always like to have some page views, so thank you for that. Okay, so the basic outline of what I wrote last week is about a year ago, I was diagnosed with terminal cancer, and it's one of those words. It's a very loaded word, and like what it really means is you have the kind of cancer there's no cure for. We can treat your cancer, but there's no medical cure for it. So what the doctors have told me essentially is, as far as we know, what you have will kill you at some point. We just don't know when. We're going to try to treat it as long as we can. We're going to try to do the best we can for it. But the reality is the reality. My cancer had spread. I have a very rare kind of cancer, and it had spread throughout my body, and there's no way to get all of it. So with most kinds of cancer, when you get it, they don't want it to have spread. You want to catch cancer early, because if you catch cancer early, you can just get it out. You radiate it, chemo, and you get it out. I can't get mine out because it's kind of everywhere. So it's been a very long process this last year, kind of coming to grips with my mortality. I'm only 34, so obviously I was not expecting to hear that. That was very shocking when I found out. It's funny, they actually thought I had long COVID. And apparently this has happened a lot in the last year, where with rare kinds of cancer, because everyone has been so COVID focused, and everyone gets COVID right at this point. Everyone's kind of gotten it. So like, wow, you have this very weird condition. We don't know what's going on. Well, it must be related to COVID. So for months, they thought I had long COVID, and they were doing that kind of stuff. And then eventually, as more and more testing is done, they figured out what I had. It's called a sarcoma. It's a Ewing's-like sarcoma. There's only 1% of cancer cases in the U.S. So I've actually talked to a few folks who've been diagnosed too. The same thing happened to them, where the medical establishment, they're so COVID focused, for good reason, obviously, that other stuff kind of has been slipping through the cracks. All that to say, it's been a very year-long process. And then after the initial shock of the mortality, a lot of my focus in this last year, so I have a 2-year-old son. So he was about 1 when I was diagnosed. And it's been I've been spending a ton of time in this last year thinking about my son. And the reality is, like, I don't know if I'll be there for him as he gets older. I can't know that anymore. Not that you could, obviously, anyone ever could, but it's a little more visceral for me. And so the piece I wrote is, does my son know you? Because there's a little bit talking about my situation now. And then going back to, as I was a child, my dad had Parkinson's. So I kind of have experienced both sides of the terminal illness condition. And the thing that struck me, especially looking back on it now when I was growing up, was that for my father, as he got sicker, he lost his community. What I found in my childhood was that people were very supportive early. As he got sicker over time, it just kind of withered away. We didn't go to church. My parents weren't very religious. They lived a very normal American life. My dad is from Nebraska. My mom's from the Philippines, and I grew up in Texas. So they moved for their careers and their jobs. Their families were very far away. When he got sick, there weren't a lot of people in our lives. And then I know when I got sick, and that was like my thought, was like, I don't want, not that my dad made mistakes necessarily, but I want my son, if something does happen to me, to have a different kind of childhood than I had. And then that's when I tied back into, for me, I'm someone who kind of converted to Christianity later in life because I didn't grow up in the church. And one of the most powerful parts for me of my Christian experience has been, they call it living in community, being in small groups and life groups, and being plugged into a church, a broader church. And then my piece is kind of, hey, this happened to me as a kid. This is my situation now. And this is how I want my experiences to inform my son's experiences. And then it also is like, okay, how can I be there for my son if I'm not there? And the answer is to be plugged in the community, to have people who will be there for my son in a way that people weren't there for me growing up. And that's kind of the whole arc of the piece.
So, I was reading your piece at the Ringer, and, first, thank you for being so transparent about your experience. I know that transparency helps an awful lot of people who are going through similar tough experiences, and it helps them feel like they're not alone. And then as I'm reading through it, that came to this unexpected turn, to me unexpected, because the Ringer's a big mainstream media outlet, and turned towards specifically about life groups and that small group connection that a lot of us who are in the church and have been in the church for a long time have. And sort of instantly for me, I felt like I get where this is going about the power of community. And so I thought, since you came to faith later in life, if you don't mind sharing sort of how you came to faith later in life, and then how you got connected to one of these smaller groups, one of these life groups, and specifically how that community has helped during this experience.
Yeah, the story of me coming to faith, I'll get into a little bit. That's a whole long story. I guess the long story short of it is I didn't grow up in the church at all. Grew up very secular lifestyle. Didn't really have, even though I grew up in Dallas, it's actually very easy to totally miss that aspect of life if you're not in it as a family. So I had really no grid for it. And then for me, I lived a very normal life. Obviously my dad's situation, I was kind of searching a lot. And I think the classic, I kind of prodigal sunned my way through searching through all the things the world thought would bring you happiness, bring you contentment. And at a certain point in my after college, I said, well, there's got to be more to life than this. This just seems kind of pointless. And that's when a coworker actually was a really strong Christian. He brought me to his life group. And I remember being so taken aback, being like, what is going on? This is so different. I don't really understand what's happening here. And he became one of my best friends, and we became very close. And I really kind of grew to respect and appreciate the way he lived his life. I remember he had already been married in college, and I'm sitting there like at 24, 25, being like, my life is a complete mess. And this guy's life, it just seems so different than mine. I respect it. And so that's where I was for a while. But for me, the big hang up was actually like believing in the supernatural. And so later on, after I'd met my friend, I actually went to a concert, and not to get too far down a rabbit hole, but I was doing some psychedelic drugs at a concert. And then that kind of opened my eyes to the idea there's more to life than what we can see and feel and touch. And it was just so shocking to me as someone who grew up really much believing that this is it, kind of a materialistic worldview. So then the idea, if there are supernatural things in the world, I was like, well, then it's very possible that God could exist. And if God exists, then I'm going to have to make some changes in my life, because I have not been living like God exists at all. So that was like the beginning of my process. And then I think, to bring it back around to life group, I remember joining a church after that happened. And it's like, it didn't seem that interesting. Like, oh, I'll go on a Sunday and I'll hear a sermon. Like, okay, like, is that it? And what really changed my life was going to life group. So it was like every week we're going to meet in someone's house. It's only like 12 to 15 people. So after a long enough period of time, you really get to know people on a very personal level. And it was so life-changing for me, especially working in the media where you're all working remotely, people you know mostly through work, and you have your friends from college. But it was not like, I didn't feel like I had a ton of people in my life really investing me on a weekly basis. You know, like, oh, hey, we're gonna go out and go get drinks. That's great, but it wasn't the same as, hey, I'm gonna pray for you every week.
Right.
And then, as time went on, I was like, this is really meaningful. Okay, I have a lot of friends now. Well, now I see the point of going to church, because I'm gonna see my friends. And that was the part, not growing up in the church, I never really understood. It was, oh, we'll go to church on Sundays and a guy will talk for a while. And it's like, well, I kind of want to sleep in and watch football. I don't want to do this. It seems kind of pointless. But now it's like, oh, man, going to church is like, man, I'm going to see all my friends and we're going to hang out. We'll go have lunch after. And it's just part of my life now. And that's been the big change for me, is like, okay, I have these people in my life. No matter where I go in the world, no matter what happens to me, I can always plug into a life group at a certain kind of church and just keep it moving. And then now, obviously, being sick, that's been like magnified tenfold.
Yeah. Well, Jonathan, can you say a little bit more about that, about the experience of being sick, but actually having community around you? Because that's a big part of your piece, as you already talked about, is the difference of being sick with or without community. And what has that meant for you to be going through your cancer struggles with this small group community?
Well, yeah, and it's the broader church community too. It's like, people come when I'm doing chemotherapy, they come in the mornings and take care of my kid. And it's like, I really can't do that when I'm doing chemo. And so that just like the little things like that. Yeah. And then it's also like, hey, we have this weekly thing to look forward to. Like, I'm really sick. I don't really want to do anything, but I'm still going to go. I have people to like connect with, plug into, care about. And it's like, it helps you to be less self-focused too, I think, because especially with something like me, it becomes very much, oh, woe is me. My life is so hard. This is so unfair. But then you're invested in other people and you're really walking out life with them, and they're still going through struggles. And then it's like, okay, I'm not the only one struggling. I can actually invest in someone else and I can help them go through this. And yeah, I have people who can invest in my wife when I'm feeling too sick. And that's, I mean, a big part of it also.
In talking about this, what strikes me in this conversation is just that presence, like just the presence of people in your life, and that consistent presence of people in your life is something that just seems to, it's the kind of thing fortunately I've not gone through a health crisis like this, but I went through a deployment to Iraq. And one of the things that was so reassuring to me was that we had that community around my wife and my kids to the point where when I wasn't available, this idea that there was a point in time when literally the gear shift of our car started to fall out. Sounds like a really weird thing. But Nancy was able to call someone in the small group to come help her literally get the car from point A to point B and, to get it repaired in a way that, just to have that sort of immediate access to people who actually love you and care for you and will drop everything to be there for you is the kind of thing that I think is when in the scripture and when you're thinking of this aspirational vision of what Christian community can be, where they'll know they're Christians by their love for each other. A lot of that has been strained of late in a lot of churches. Is this a kind of thing that you've seen in your church community, that there's been strains in your church community, or has it kind of come through COVID and all of the contention of the time pretty still bonded close to each other, as close as you were before? Are you starting to see some of these strains that are in the larger culture infiltrating into, and you don't have to talk about your own life group, that's its own separate thing, its own space, but is this something that you're seeing these kinds of strains starting to break these and kind of what seem to be unshakable bonds? Or in your community, are they remaining pretty intact in your experience?
I mean, it's definitely been a struggle. I think it's hard for me sometimes because I've only been in one church. So I don't have a great grid for like the broader church, right? I have like a one-to-one. I always laugh at my wife, like, I only know one pastor. I only know one way of doing things. I just think, for all I know, how we do things is very abnormal. I have no basis of comparison. I think for sure the last 2 years, and what's funny? It's been less about COVID and more about, for the last 2 years, because we're all my friends, we're all in our early 30s. Everyone's having kids. That's been really the bigger crucible. It's like when you have a kid, okay, am I still going to invest in life group? Am I still going to get plugged in? Because there's more and more responsibilities. It becomes more and more difficult. Like, I kind of glance on that in the piece. I don't really get into it too much, but it's like me and my wife, we talk about all the time. It's like, are these people really committed? Because you have to make it a priority. I think one thing, like on a societal level, is like, I think our society pushes people apart a lot. Like, we just live in us sort of atomized, right? We live in a society where it's easy to not be in a community. It's easy to be self-reliant. It's easy to just order things online. And I think with COVID is more, it's like, it's easy to isolate yourself. You have to really want to do this. Hey, we're going to meet in a park because it's not safe to meet inside, but it's kind of cold outside. Well, I don't really want to do that. It's cold outside. It's had a long day at work. And the next thing you know, they're not there for a month. And then it's like, you lose touch so fast. So it's like, you have to be able to push back against it. And I think that's really, for me, it's like growing up without the church is like, man, it is so hard to maintain relationships in the way we live our lives as a society. Like, American society, there's pluses and minuses, obviously, but I think the way our society is structured, it's very much structured for self-involvement, self-advancement. Hey, I'm going to sacrifice some of my own personal goals for be part of a community. And that's like the give and take of it is, okay, I'm tired. My kid's he's in a bad mood. I just want to put him down and just rest tonight. I don't want to go to life group. But okay, no, that's the easy way. And the hard way is it's the simple, small choices you make on a weekly basis. Or, it's obviously with everything going on politically, it's easy to be like, man, I don't like what they believe. They didn't vote for the person I voted for. I don't share their values anymore. I don't like this. And it's that can drive you apart, or you have to choose, right? And me and my wife always joke, it's sometimes your friends are not the friends you thought they would be, right? The people in life group who you really like, who you think are funny, who you think are cool. I want to hang out with those guys, but they got their own thing. They're not as committed. It's the people who are faithful sometimes aren't the ones you'd expect, aren't the ones you would necessarily naturally gravitate towards, right? They might not look like you. They might not think like you, but you know what? They have these same fundamental core beliefs, and we're going to walk with them. So I think that's the thing, is just with everything going on, it's just very easy to fracture and not be part of a community. And there are costs to being in a community, but I think ultimately the benefits of it are so much greater. And that's kind of where I land on it.
Well, it's interesting because we talk a lot in the Good Faith about, as David has mentioned, the fracturing and the strains on the church. Your experience, suggests to me that, while that's going to be present at all levels of the church, even in a small group, in some ways it's the hardest, or it's the most durable form of a Christian community. You can leave a Sunday service because you don't like whatever is being said, or that you see somebody wearing a hat representing a political view that you don't like, or something like that, right? Like, that's easy to do. It's still possible to leave a small group, but it's harder once you've had the face-to-face bond where that person has fixed your car or has accompanied you to chemo. It's harder to leave that. Like, there's a more durable bond. And I wonder if, you're an astute observer of the popular culture as well. How much do you think that the American church, through small group communities, is kind of where the path forward is for how Christianity is going to still, thrive and bless the wider world? That it's not in these large flashy services or big. It's going to be precisely in the experiences you've described, in these small groups of faithful people being faithful to God and to each other. I mean, what's your thoughts on kind of stepping back and looking at 30,000 view, the power of the small group, which is really a very distinctive feature of Christianity? Like, I look around the world, like the secular world, like there's AA groups, there's like there's not that many analogs to this idea of a small group community. So I just love your cultural observation on small groups and the broader community.
Yeah, I think what it comes back to is, one, like, you have to be countercultural. If you're going to offer what the culture offers, then what's the point?
Right.
And I think for me, joining the church, I think if I had joined a church without a strong small group situation, I probably would have eventually kind of washed out. Because it's just like I think for so many people outside the church, I know for me specifically, in my head, I had this idea: somebody goes to church, it's a thing you do on Sundays, and it's a thing you do at the ballot box. Like, I literally had a conversation with my pastor. I'm like, do I have to be a Republican now? How does this work? Because in my head, I'm like, well, I'm going to church. We're going to be like a Republican rally because we're going to talk about abortion all the time. Like, that's what we do in church. And like, that is kind of how it's portrayed outside the church. And like, whatever with that stuff. But like, that's not going to get people to stick together. That's not offering them something different. And I think the idea of being in a community, that is what's really powerful. And of course, we're a big believer. I guess I can say this in this kind of, we're an Acts 2:40 church, or whatever. Acts 2, the early church, they all came together, shared all things equally, all this stuff. And like, that's like the foundation of our church network. Like, I think there's like I can't remember, there's a group that we're part of like that. And it's like, that is the point. That's what's different. And I always say, it's like, I think the reason in our culture, people always say college was the best time in my life. Like, you hear that all the time. I remember going to college, they told you that this is the best time of your life. This is where you'll make your friends, you'll have the rest of your life. It's because college naturally provides smaller groups. You're part of a community. You're known. Okay, I'm in this person. I'm in this frat. We're part of the Greek system, right? I'm in this club. I work for the newspaper. I have some identity piece, part of a bigger thing that people know who I am. I'm somebody. And then you go out in the world, you don't have that. You have a job. And it's like, you can get fired. Your friends can leave. And I think for me, I'm like, man, I'm so glad that I'm not depending on my college friends for my community anymore. Not that I didn't love my college friends. We had great times. We live all over the country now. It's not the same as it was when we were in school. So like, I think for so many people, they leave college and they don't have that. They don't have that sense of community. There's no way to replace that. The best they can do is work usually. And then work. You get transferred, you get fired, you get promoted, you get a new job. And it's gone all of a sudden, and you've lost your community. It's like, that's what I think church can offer people. It's like, hey, you can be part of something bigger than yourself. You can be part of a group of people. My wife gets mad at me about this because I went to a small high school, and she went to a big high school. And I'm always like, man, church is like high school, except everyone's really nice. And she's like, no, I went to a really big high school. No one knew who I was there. But my school had like 80 kids a grade. So we were all really well known. Everyone
Yeah.
knew who each other were. And like, that is such a powerful thing to be known. I kind of talk about in the piece. It's like the Cheers song. You want to know, go where everybody knows your name.
Yeah.
And there's no way to do that anymore in our society. Like, you know, that's like the
Mm-hmm.
famous, like, bowling alone, right? Like, our society has been atomized. There are no groups anymore. We're all individuals. And it's like, hey, that's cool if that's how you want to live your life. But I think for the church that's going to survive these times, these coming times, these times we're in now, is the church that says, no, you're not alone. You're part of something. And I think that's where ultimately the rest of the stuff comes and goes. Like, you know, we were talking for the podcast about, you know, David obviously covers politics and the war and all this stuff. And it's like, that's so out of my control. Like, I can't control what happens in the war.
Mm-hmm.
It's, you know, I can control what happens in my life. I can impact people's lives on a personal level. The big picture stuff. And I think for me, like, one thing that really struck me when I became a Christian, and then I'm reading Jesus, I'm reading Paul's letters, I'm reading Peter's letters. They're not talking about politics, right?
Yeah.
You know, and from the American point of view, you would expect Paul and Peter to be like, man, the Romans are evil. The Romans literally worshiped their king as a god and ruled the entire planet, right? They was evil. And they're like, you know what, man, whatever, honor the emperor, just be a good citizen, love your neighbor. That's how we're going to change the world. We're going to love people. We're not going to like start a rebellion and crush the Romans. Like, we're going to love each other. And that's like you said, we're going to love each other. That's how we'll be known for loving each other. And that's how we can all do.
You know, I was talking in a church a couple of weeks ago, and you raised that point that you raised, just raised the topic of what I was talking about. And something that's haunted me for a lot of my life as a Christian is when Jesus came, the Son of God comes to the earth, and people were looking for a Messiah. Like, they were longing for Messiah. They were looking for one. And you had all of these people who'd studied Scripture, you know, their entire lives to the extent that, you know, they had memorized it to an extent that would stagger the imagination of you know, those of us who walk through.
Well, David, you should read
life.
Jonathan's private blog. He's got a really kick-ass outline of the book of Isaiah going on his blogs. So,
love the shout out.
Amazing. Amazing. So anyway, all of these people were looking for a Messiah, including the most learned people in the law and Scripture, and they missed him. And they just missed him. They didn't know who was with them, and because they had such a frame on what that was going to look like, and had such a longing for a particular kind of person. And you know, you raised this was, you know, the Jewish people at the time were under the boot heel of Roman oppression, and they were looking for somebody who would save the world politically. And that is not what occurred. And it was so far out of the paradigm that they were, you know, even his own disciples to the very end are still, they've been hanging with him the whole time, and they're still thinking along those lines. And I think that's such a powerful expression you just said of where is our focus? Who are we paying attention to? Is it the person right across, sitting right across from us in our living room, versus the person who, as much as we sympathize or empathize with their situation halfway around the world, we can have care, we can act in the life of the person who's directly in front of us. And I see so many relationships fractured because of the thoughts people have about things that are distant from them, as opposed to the interactions and the relationships that they have with the people close to them. And it's incredibly grievous. This isn't a question. It's more of a TED Talk all of a sudden. But anyway, one of the things that strikes me about what you talked about, and Chris highlighted it, producer Chris highlighted it in our chat, is how difficult it is. And I think that I just want to drill down on this point that you raised about once you get in your 30s with kids. I have talked to, I'm older than you, I'm 53. I've talked to so many men my age who that is exactly the time, the 30s and 40s, when their kids are young or going into middle school and they're getting involved in all the practices and everything, when they will say, that's when I lost touch with my friends. And the number of people, men now who are in their 50s, who don't have close friends is staggering. It's just staggering. And I think it's so important, what you're talking about here, and your own personal situation just brings it in such stark relief of the incredible importance of intentionally maintaining these relationships. Because, number one, it's going to enable you to be there for people in a moment of crisis. Number two, you might face the crisis. And then number three, as life marches on, and if you let this slide, the downstream consequences I've seen in men in their 50s is just beyond sad. So hashtag in TED Talk.
Well, I think I kind of hit on in the piece. It's like, so when you get sick, and the first thing after the doctors tell you, they'll say, okay, we have people at the hospital who specialize in wills. You got to get your insurance figured out. You got to get your life insurance. And obviously everyone's like, well, how's your medical insurance? You're going to need that. You're going to need insurance. And like, I think we all understand, you need insurance, you need car insurance, life insurance, health insurance. I think what Americans don't have is relational insurance. I think that's such an important point because, what a lot of times, I think for me, before I joined the church, I had like maybe 2 or 3 really close friends. And it's like, I'm depending so much on these 2 or 3 people to sustain me relationally. That puts a lot of pressure on the relationship, but it's like, what if one of these guys has to move? What if one of these guys gets a new job and they're just not around as much anymore? I have nothing to fall back on. I have no one, I have no net I'm on a very thin margin for error. And I think that's most people, especially as they get older, they don't have a lot of relational insurance. And you can go through life, for the most part, right? Especially in our society, you can go through life without it as long as things are going well, right? It's like with anything. Like most times you don't need your car insurance. You're just not going to get an accident. You just go through your life. But Lord forbid something happens, now you've got no insurance, right? My gosh, if I didn't have my church, if I didn't have all of this, and then I got sick, it's like, what would I even have done? I don't even know. Like, I would have had no one to support me.
I love that term, relational insurance. It's not, I think, because it covers not just how exposed you are in terms of friendships outside your family, but actually it also puts an enormous amount of stress on your marriage, because that's where a lot of the men, they put all of their, like they're cut off from all of their external friends outside the nuclear family. They've invested all in and relied solely on their marriage and their family. And that actually puts an undue level of pressure that your spouse has to be everything for you, especially in moments of crisis. That is difficult for any one person to handle that. And you need to I love that concept of because insurance is really just dispersal of risk, among others, right, who are sharing that risk with you. And and I'd just be curious to kind of, if you'd be willing to share, like, have you found that how have you found what helps maintain those bonds other than the small group community? Are there other things that people can do to make sure that they are actually investing beyond themselves, beyond their nuclear family?
Well, I mean, I think small group and church, it's just being intentional and prioritizing relationships. There's so many, I think we all, every day you have choices in your life about what to do, what to focus on. And I think too, it's like, we all have hobbies. We all have interests. It's like, let me try to involve other people in my interests. So I'll give an example from my life. So my day job, I cover the NBA. And then one thing that's really helped me in my job and personally is like, I've tried to develop relationships with a lot of beat writers who cover individual teams. So like, I have a really good friend who covers the Minnesota Timberwolves, and like, he lives in Minnesota. We're not like super close, but we talk because like, when I'm watching a Timberwolves game, I might reach out to him. Hey, I noticed this about the Timberwolves. And it's like, that started small. And now because we had this shared interest, now we've grown relationally through sharing this interest. And now it's not just, well, I gotta watch the Timberwolves because, I got to cover this team. It's like, well, my friend is like really into the Timberwolves. He watches every game. I can talk to him about it. And now we have a relationship. Now we're not just friends. with the Timberwolves, we're just friends in real life because we have this shared interest. So it's like, I know for me, I'm always trying to find people who share my interests. If I know I'm going to be doing this one thing, let me find someone who else into it too, and we'll grow a relationship. And so, like, yeah, a lot of times, so like I always, for me, another good example, like a lot of times I'll get asked to talk about, oh, hey, come talk to my pod about the Cavaliers or the Bulls pod. And it's like, okay, I'm going to do this not because I need to or promote myself, but man, I would love to know someone who covers this team. I would love to develop a relationship with that person. And then that's a good start for that. So like, I guess that's a practical example of how I try to do it.
Yeah. The other day, one of the kind of things I didn't anticipate to happen as a result of all the pandemic isolation was I ended up talking to a whole lot of people unexpectedly on Zoom. I would get an email sometimes that would say, hey, me and my friends from church really like reading you. Is there any chance, shot in the dark, you'd be willing to jump on a Zoom call? And, most of the time, if I had time, I'd say, yeah, I'll do that. I mean, why not? And the other day I was on a Zoom call with a bunch of friends from college. They were all Christians. They were all part of the same campus ministry. And they're exactly your age, in their 30s. And they said to me, what is, as someone older than us, what's some of your counsel? And I said, this right here, this group right here, you got to be so intentional about keeping this together. I mean, this has to be a priority. You can't get in a habit of saying, if you have an annual gathering or a twice annual gathering, well, I won't make it this year because, or if you have routines where you get together, you can't get in the habit of saying, I won't make it this year because I guarantee you that I've run into so many people who are exactly my age that they say, I don't really know what happened to my relationships. I don't know. It's like they just faded away. And I think if there's one takeaway that people have from this podcast, that intentionality, it matters. And it doesn't just matter for your own self-fulfillment. It matters for how much you can be a part of somebody else's life when they're going through an immense challenge. So to me, it's really convicting to me to hear, because I have this tendency to focus out there because that's my job. We kind of, we're focused. We kind of have similar professions in that we're always focused on something that is kind of downstream from people's lives. Although I will say the Grizzlies are not that far downstream from me, but we're kind of focusing on things that are downstream from people's lives, and that has a tendency to get me downstream, and diving into these more global issues when there's stuff happening right 6 inches in front of my face.
David, can I interject with, because I think it'd be helpful to illustrate Jonathan's point in our own lives, David, in our friendship between you, me, and producer Chris, because Jonathan, the only reason why we're doing this podcast together is because actually the three of us are part of a fantasy baseball league that goes back about, 30 years, David, right? It's about 30 years at this point.
91 was our
first started draft, from law school. And we meet
92.
We meet every year in person, about a group of 15 of us from across the country, to do our fantasy baseball draft. But it's really an excuse to get back together, and our during the year trash talking about stuff over email on our fantasy baseball teams is really an excuse to keep together over 30 years. And Chris, Carter, Dave Frenchme, and about 12 or 13 other guys are part of this. And it's such a rare thing in all of our lives. Like, we all make it a priority, generally speaking, to come every year. We haven't been able to the last 2 years, but actually this weekend is our annual draft. We're going to convene in Scottsdale, Arizona, to do our draft and reconnect in person. So that leads to the question I have for you, is because sports, you cover sports, and sports in our case of our cohort of guys has been this sort of bonding sort of ingredient, if you will, that helped us keep together relationally. And I think that for men, and since we're talking especially about men, it can have that effect because it is a common interest. In my experience, though, there's a counterpoint to that, in that I also find, I'm a former pastor, but I've also observed that when men get together, it's also that sports bond, for instance, is a helpful initial ingredient that gives them something to talk about and chat about. But it can also be very hard for them to actually move beyond that. That they actually sort of stay there, and it's almost hard for them to talk about intimate issues about family, home struggle, because they're sort of so used to and more comfortable in talking about how the Mavs, the Warriors, or the Grizzlies are doing. As somebody who covers sports and yet so gets the importance of this deep, intimate connection, life on life, can you speak to that dynamic of where sports is both a lubricant and a repellent in some ways for deeper relationships?
Yeah, I think it's kind of what you hit on. It's funny being married, and it's just different when you're not married. When you're married, you really see how the other half live, how women live their lives, and how my wife and her friends, they can just go deep instantly. Like they're just, let's talk about our feelings, let's talk about our relationships. And I'm just like, oh, okay. And I think as guys, we have it's harder for us for whatever reason, just the way we're wired to do that. And it's hard. It is like, you do need, for guys, you do seem to need that kind of, like, you need something, the common interest, right? I think what I love about like my life group when I first started is like, hey, we did life group, and then at the last 15 minutes, we're all going to pair off. And it's like, how can I pray for you? And I feel like so often for me, when I'm talking to my friends, I'm talking for a while, it's like, hey, conversation's wrapping up. How can I pray for you? And that is so often the segue into, let's actually talk about what's going on in your life. Like, let's go to what's really going on. How are you really doing? How can I pray? And that's where God is so important too. That's where, being a brother in Christ, that's the whole point, right? It's like, hey, yeah, we have this shared interest of sports, but ultimately our shared interest is God, is Jesus, is that relationship, right? And that is supposed to be the one that's like so much more, is it Galatians, whatever the one Paul says, like, we're neither male nor female, Roman or Gentile or whatever. Like, that is the one where it's like, okay, let's go deeper. Let's find this deeper thing to connect on than just our love of sports. It's like, yeah, and sometimes in the church, like, some of my best friends in church are really big into basketball, and we'll talk about basketball, but some are not. And it's like, we don't have that. It's a little harder sometimes to connect because we don't have that obvious natural connection point, but it can be so good. It can be so challenging. And that's something too, like in life groups, a lot of times, I feel like I've had to develop my ability. When you're growing up, it's like, I hate small talk. I hate it's so pointless. It's like, no, this is important to learn how to connect to people who you might not otherwise connect to, right? Like, sometimes you have to push through that initial, we're not very similar. Kind of what I was talking about before, like, we wouldn't really be friends outside of a life group setting because I wouldn't be naturally drawn to you in the same way you wouldn't be naturally drawn to me. But we're going to push through that. We're going to believe there's like something here for us. And ultimately, right, we're going to trust that God's put us in each other's lives for a reason. We don't always necessarily know what, right? God's reasoning is always beyond us. We don't necessarily know what God's plan for anything is. But I'm going to trust that you're here and I'm here for something. And there's something we can connect over, and it's bigger than just, the NBA. That's as big as the NBA is.
As big as it is. Well, if you don't mind me asking, how are you doing now? How are you feeling now? You're, I'm listening to you on the NBA podcast, and you're just, you sound great. and frankly, and how can we pray for you? Now that we haven't met in person yet, but I see you, how can we pray for you?
Yeah, so I'm back in chemotherapy. It's very difficult. So I go in every 3 weeks, and I go in 5 days a week in that time. So, and that's just getting started again. I'll probably be doing that for substantial amount of time. Unclear how long. Yeah, I mean, in just that process. And the thing that's been, and for me, I did not expect, is with chemotherapy, for as tough as it is, actually the hardest part is just breaking your routines.
Mm.
Like imagine like we are routine creatures in a lot of ways. And so imagine every 3 weeks having to drop your entire schedule and just, okay, I'm doing something else now. And then you get out of it and then you're back into normal life. And then you're just when you get comfortable again, and that's how it works with chemo, is just when you start to feel good again, you go back. Right? It's like, okay, you're feeling better now, we can put you back in it again. So I think, I mean, and in terms of prayer for me, like it's been hard. Like
Yeah.
I talked a lot in the piece about like, hey, life groups, and that's been so good for me because that's something very tangible. In terms of, for me, it's been a very challenging experience. My personal walk with God has been very, very challenged by this. It forces you. There's a lot of easy answers, right? When you start talking about why is there suffering? Why do some people have harder lives than others? What is going on? What is the point? And it's very easy when you're not going through it to have a very, oh yeah, cliche answer. When you're actually going through it, it's like, this is horrible. Like, I can't believe this is happening. So like that part of it is something I'm still working through. Like I'm still trying to figure out, like it's easy to say, oh, life isn't fair. Yeah, life isn't fair. But when it's not fair to you, it's very different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Jonathan, thank you.
Yeah.
That, I mean, it's I love how real and honest you've been about your experience. I definitely, you're on the Chang family prayer list now, and we encourage our listeners to similarly pray for you. I wonder, especially, certainly want to pray for you individually in just your own life, but you seem to be like, this isn't the first time you've written about this experience, even in the Ringer. You're pretty out there in processing your experience, including your spiritual life, in this very secular, publication and context of the Ringer. I just love to hear, like, are you sensing as best as you can that this is a calling on your part to somehow translate the world of faith to the secular audience? Or is that, I mean, is there any sense of like, I really hate the idea that, I don't believe the idea that God causes illness for a purpose. I actually think theologically that's not the wrong way to think about this. I think this is just an awful thing that's happening. But there is such a thing as redemption, and there's a thing of working good out of something bad. How are you trying to process a redemptive, opportunity in this? And is the writing part of that?
For sure. I mean, I think for me, it's the writing and the faith aspect. I think if I wasn't, okay, this is an opportunity for me to live out my faith, to talk about my faith. This is like, I feel like the calling God has put on my life is to be in this platform. It's an opportunity to reach people who would otherwise never hear about it, who would have, kind of like how I was before I became a Christian, right? Like, I feel like God has placed me here. I mean, I remember, so I became a Christian years before I was at the Ringer, and I was very struggling. I was kind of trying to make it. It's a very tough business. I remember praying a lot. I was like, God, if I can have a kind of job I would like to have, I want to use that not just for myself. I want to use that to talk about you. And it's like, almost like, let's make a deal. Like, can you do this for me? I'm not going to forget where I came from and how you led me here. And I think for me, without that aspect of it, I probably wouldn't talk about it at all publicly because it's so painful. But it's like, okay, this is an opportunity. And like, so what you were asking about being on a more mainstream site, I don't think realistically, because like you said, I have like a personal blog where I kind of go through scripture that helped me in my life. That's not something I would have even brought to the Ringer. They wouldn't publish it because it's just not what they do. But because of this very unique situation I'm in, it's kind of like a window in, like, hey, no one's going to tell a dying man he can't talk about God. Like, it's just not going to. Right? So it's like, okay, this is my chance to talk about this. This is my belief. And I mean, I've been praying a lot. I'm like, God, if I don't die of this, it would be pointing to you because the doctors already said they can't cure me. So if I did cure, so maybe if I was cured, it would point back to you. I don't know how this is going to work
Come
out.
on, God, let's do that.
I'd love to believe that's how this is
Can
going to end.
Can we give whatever Jonathan has over to Vladimir Putin? That's my prayer now.
Well, let's not go there.
Oh no, we're going there. We go there in the good faith, Jonathan.
On his plate. Let's love our enemies, right?
Okay, very good. I'm getting theologically schooled here by the NBA writer.
Well, and it's interesting. I saw that was it in the Gospel Coalition that you did an interview about your experience and I think it's Acts 29 Church, right?
That's the one. Well, yeah. I honestly can't remember exactly.
Yeah, well, I think it's Acts 29. There is an Acts 29 network, but anyway, that's kind of connected with the Gospel Coalition. And I saw you were interviewed in the Gospel Coalition about your experience working as a Christian writer in a secular publication. And I was really interested in your answers because I'm a Christian writer. I work in secular publications. And, I don't know if this has been your experience, but really, if this matches your experience. But I found that it's in some ways both less and more of a big deal than people imagine. Less in the sense of sort of less challenging, less difficult, but in an interesting way, more meaningful than I thought it would be, in the extent of the ability to reach people. There are more people out there than I realized who were deeply curious and deeply interested in faith matters that were never going to read, say, the Gospel Coalition or Christianity Today or something like that. And so I don't know if that's been my perception of your response, of the response that you got to that piece you wrote for The Ringer, which we'll put in the show notes, is very powerful, is that it sparked a lot of conversation in people who are not in church, and sparked a lot of conversation in people who might be just at most church curious, but have a deep longing for not just sort of meaning and purpose as sort of in abstract concepts, but connection. And so I don't know if that's been your experience. It's kind of been my experience in these more secular spaces being a Christian. But it's evident to me as a loyal Ringer listener that you've got fans at the Ringer. They love you. And it just seems to be, a real testimony to your presence there.
Well, thanks. I appreciate you saying that. And I think on a broader level, for anyone listening to this who maybe doesn't work in the media, but it's the same concept of there's all these people in our lives who don't go to church, who aren't Christians, who aren't going to come to church, right? You kind of got to meet them where they are. Like, I always think back to myself, like, if my friend who's a writer had invited me to church, I would never have been like, hey, man, I want to go to church. I heard you go to church. Can I come with you? Like, that would never have happened, right? He had to be the one to make the step, make the move. And I think there's people in all our lives, like, and it's always this balance, right? Like, because you want to have church. You have to have church community. You have to be grounded in something. But you also have to reach out, right? We're not tasked just to love each other. We're tasked to love our neighbors who aren't already in the church, and to bring them in, to invite them in. Yeah, and it's like wherever you are, like, as kind of was saying, like, most people work at secular environments. They don't work in church settings. So, okay, I have all these friends from work who don't know me, who don't know the church. I can present the church to them without being preachy. That's also, it's hard to draw that line too, but like, how can I present to them? And I always think back to myself and my friend. I remember him telling me, like, I never thought you would. I just do it for everyone. I never thought you'd be really interested. You never know who's interested until you tell them.
Yeah.
So, Jonathan, we're running close to the end of time here. We're going to absolutely have to invite you back because there's like a whole host of things that this conversation has opened up. I was wanting to talk to you more about just kind of the weird ways in which religion and sports bear some similarities and differences in terms of kind of fandom and loyalty and where we pin our hopes on. But we're gonna, if you're be willing, we definitely want to have you back. But we need to ask you one last question, because Dave and I, like we've talked about, we've been friends for some 25, 30 years. There's one looming threat to the durability of our friendship coming up, and that is if the Warriors go against the Grizz in the playoffs.
Hey, here we go.
I'm a diehard Dubs fan. David's a Grizz fan. I think our friendship can survive a 7-game series, but I'm not sure. But help us navigate that. Jonathan, give us your take. If right now where things stand, let's assume Draymond comes back. Grizz Warriors, what's your call?
And Dylan Brooks is back and fully healthy.
There you go. I mean, I think the hope for the NBA is that, so the Warriors have obviously been great for a long time, but now it's like they've gone from they used to be the young team to now they're the established team. So now the next thing is you want them to face the next team, right? Because like the best NBA, like the NBA has always been built on the teams coming up, there's a team in their way, young versus old, experience versus youth, all this kind of stuff. Now, how do we push past that? And like, those are always the most fun rivalries, right? It's like, you're standing in my way, but like, I still want to be here. So, Warriors, Grizzlies, I mean, the West is open. I think with the Warriors, you saw with Draymond being out, they've just looked like a different team. And I think sometimes, especially with like a player like Draymond's not going to score 30 points, right? That's not his game. So it's very easy to not be appreciated. Player like him sometimes is not appreciated until he's gone. And it's like, oh man, look at how different the team looks about all the little things that Draymond Green did. I would say in terms of Warriors, Grizzlies, I think the real pressure point, everyone's going to talk obviously about Steph Curry, John Morant, right? Those are your two superstars, engines of your offense, very exciting players. I think what it would actually come down to is the big men. So Jaren Jackson, Draymond Green. And that's a fun thing because they're both Michigan State guys. It's the same kind of thing. Jaren Jackson, 22 years old, very young, learning the game, still pretty raw, very inconsistent. Draymond, but he's also 6'11", very physically gifted, very talented. Okay, is he ready to actually overcome Draymond Green? Can he score on Draymond Green, one of the best defensive centers ever? I think that would end up being the big determining matchup. For as much as Steph and Ja get the love, it would probably actually be Draymond versus Jaren Jackson. And I think right now I got to go with the experienced player, if he's healthy, and that's always what comes down to. So Draymond, it's very concerning. I'm sure it started as a calf injury and then became a lower back issue, became a disc issue. A disc issue for an undersized big man in his 30s is as concerning as it gets. I got to put a plug in. I'm from Dallas. Before you worry about the Warriors, Grizzlies, Mavs, Luka versus Ja, that's what's going to be exciting if that goes down.
Yeah, that is not the matchup I want in the. That's why I think the second seed is pretty darn important because I don't want to see the Mavs in round one. But I got to say, I was at the Grizzlies game and that team is so joyful to watch. Like they seem to like each other. They seem to love to play the game together. And my gosh, they are fast. But anyway, Curtis has to go. We could start to. We're marching down a road that could go down a whole another extended podcast. So thanks for your transparency at the Ringer, and you've got a personal blog, right?
Yeah, so I actually was going through the book of Isaiah, and then when I got sick, it's kind of like I'm like halfway through it. So what I like to do is go over. So like I think I'm at Isaiah 35, and so I'll like, okay, here's Isaiah 35. Here's one thing that stood out to me about Isaiah 35. I'm going to talk about it, and that's been for me really helpful in terms of applying my faith as a writer. I'm like, okay, this is a way, it's a task I can do that brings me closer to God while also pulling other people towards him as best I can. And I've been going through the book of Isaiah. I'm excited to get that going again. And I think, I'll say real quickly, like, I think Christians should look more back to their history. I think it's very easy to just kind of Christianity, I'm living my life, Acts 29, yes. But history is very interesting in terms of the history of Israel, the Old Testament. There's so much great stuff in there that we don't talk about enough, but there's so many lessons for our lives that we can apply today. I mean, like, if you're into the war and politics, let me tell you, ancient Israel, there was a lot of wars. There was a lot of politics. A lot of crazy stuff went down that we don't talk about enough, I don't think.
Yeah, true. Now, what's the URL for it?
So it's Tjarks Books, my last name, books.blogspot.com. I think easiest, if you go to my Twitter page, there's a link to it on top of my Twitter page.
And Tjarks is spelled Tjarks.
Yes.
For those listeners who don't.
Now, we'll put that in the show notes. Isaiah is my favorite Old Testament book. I really loved reading it, Jonathan. So you're doing a great job.
Thanks.
On
I
that
appreciate that.
as well. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much again, Jonathan. And thank you, listeners, as always. Please go rate us, subscribe, all of that stuff. And tune in next week when we'll be back. And as I said before, we've got some really interesting guests coming up. So stay tuned. I think we'll probably have them for next week as well. So please stay tuned. As I said, rate us, and please check out my newsletter at thedispatch.com.